wiki. Vesalius, who was a very eminent doctor in the time of the Emperor Charles V, realized that you couldn't really do a great many valuable medical things unless you dissected corpses. And so he used to dissect corpses. Now, the Emperor Charles V was a valetudinarian and thought this was the only doctor who would keep him well. So he protected him. But after the Emperor had abdicated, there was nobody to protect him. And he was condemned for having dissected a body which they said was not quite dead, and was condemned as a penalty to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the way he got shipwrecked and died of hardship, and that was the end of him. And all this because there was this taboo against cutting up corpses.
What harm do you think taboo morality is doing today? And if it is doing it today, what ought we to do about it?
Well, it certainly is doing harm today. Take, for example, the question of birth control. There's a very powerful taboo by certain sections of the community, which is calculated to do very enormous harm. Very enormous harm. It is calculated to promote poverty and war, and to make the solution of many social problems impossible. That's, I think, perhaps the most important. Then I think there are a number of others about, well, the indissolubility of marriage. There are all sorts of taboos of that sort that seem to me to be quite definitely harmful, and to be based solely upon ancient tradition and not upon an examination of present circumstances.
Lord Russell, what is your definition of fanaticism?
I should say that fanaticism consists in thinking some one matter so overwhelmingly important that it outweighs everything else at all. To take an example, I suppose all decent people dislike cruelty to dogs. But if you thought that cruelty to dogs was so atrocious that no other cruelty should be objected to in comparison, then you would be a fanatic.
But do you think this has happened a great deal in human history, that large groups of people have been seized with fanaticism?
Yes, it's happened at most periods in most parts of the world. It's one of the diseases of the mind to which communities are subject.
Which would you say were some of the worst occasions?
There have been various occasions one could mention. Take anti-Semitism. That is one of the most dreadful, because that's the worst manifestations of that are recent, and were so dreadful one can hardly bear to think of them. Well, that, though I know it isn't the right thing to say, it isn't considered the right thing to say, but anti-Semitism mainly came in with Christianity. Before that there was very, very much less. But the moment the Roman government became Christian, it began to be anti-Semitic.
Why was that?
Because they said that the Jews killed Christ, and so it gave them a justification for hating the Jews. I've no doubt there really were economic motives, but that was the justification.
But why do you think people do get seized in large numbers with fanaticism?
Well, it's partly that it gives you a cozy feeling of cooperation. A fanatical group all together have a comfortable feeling that they're all friends of each other. They're all very much excited about the same thing. You can see it in any political party. There's always a fringe of fanatics in any political party. And they feel awfully cozy with each other. And when that is spread about and is combined with a propensity to hate some other group, you get fanaticism well developed.
But might not fanaticism at times provide a kind of mainspring for good actions?
It provides a mainspring for actions, all right, but I can't think of any instance in history where it's provided a mainspring for good actions. Always, I think, for bad ones. Because it is partial, because it almost inevitably involves some kind of hatred. You hate the people who don't share your fanaticism. It's almost inevitable.
But then if it gets taken over by economic considerations, say that like the Crusades, then fanaticism disappears and perhaps does no harm.
Well, I don't know. I can't think of any good that the Crusades did. The Crusades had, of course, two different streams in them, a fanatical stream and an economic stream. The economic thing was very strong indeed, but it wouldn't have worked without the fanaticism. The fanaticism provided the troops and the economic motive the generals, roughly speaking.
But what part would you say that witchcraft has played in fanaticism?
Oh, witchcraft played a terrible, terrible part, especially from about 1450 to about 1600, a little longer than 1600. Quite terrible part. There was a work called The Hammer of Female Malefactors, which was written by an eminent ecclesiastic and inspired the most mad profusion of witch hunts, which the people themselves believed. I think it's very likely that Joan of Arc believed she was a witch. Certainly a great many people condemned as witches did believe they were witches. And there was an enormous spread of cruelty. Now, Sir Thomas Browne, you would say, when you read his works, he seems like a very humane and cultivated person. But he actually took part in trials of witches on the side of the prosecution, and he said that to deny witchcraft is a form of atheism, because after all the Bible says thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and therefore if you don't think it's right to burn the people you think witches, you must be disbelieving in the Bible and therefore be an atheist.
But how is it that quite sane people, on the surface at any rate, can be fanatical?
Well, sanity is a relative term. Very, very few people are sane all through. Almost everybody has corners where they're mad. I remember once I was motoring in California on a very, very wet day, and we picked up a pedestrian who was getting wet through, and he inveighed against all kinds of race prejudice. He said it was the most dreadful thing, and I entirely agreed with him. And then somebody mentioned the Philippines, and he said, all Filipinos are vile. Well, you see, he had that little corner of insanity.
But why do you attach so much importance to the subject of fanaticism?
Because a very great part of the evils that the world is suffering are due to fanaticism. A very, very great part. Always has been so, and it's worse in the present day than it's ever been before. I don't think fanaticism is more prevalent, but it is doing more harm than it has ever done before in human history.
Well, can you elaborate that a bit?
Yes, certainly. It deserves to be elaborated. I think that the East-West tension, which is threatening us all in the most terrible fashion, is mainly due to fanatical belief in communism or anti-communism, as the case may be. Both sides believe their own creed too strongly. They believe it in the way that I defined as fanatical, that they think, that is to say, that the prevention of what they regard as wicked on the other side is more important even than the continued existence of the human race, and that is fanatical. And it is that fanaticism which is threatening us all, a fanaticism which exists on both sides.